evening and welcome to the Journey Home. This is another Journey Home special that we're filming from Canada. Again, we're here in the chapel of the Grand Seminary of Montreal as a part of our trip to Canada. And we have another guest with us. John Scott is a former Presbyterian pastor. And John, it's great to be with you here in this Grand Seminary. Have you ever been here before?
No, I haven't, no.
It's a pretty amazing place.
It is.
In fact, as I talked to one of the earlier guests, it was neat to imagine at one time that these seats were full in here with vocations, and now that's not quite the same. And so a part of our prayer is for continued vocations here in Canada. We are filming this in Quebec, but you're from Ontario, is that correct?
Yes, I have lived in Montreal, but now I'm living north of Ottawa.
All right. Near Combermere?
My heart is near Combermere, but we're about 2 hours between Ottawa and Combermere.
All right. Well, usually in the Journey Home program, I ask the guest to begin at the beginning and give us a summary of your spiritual background before you became Catholic.
Born into a Presbyterian home, very strongly connected with Scottish Presbyterianism, the Free Church style, and when I was a teenager, had a period of intellectual rebellion and rejecting the faith, followed by a dramatic conversion at age 18, coming to the Lord and with great vigor and being very evangelistic afterwards and involved in the charismatic renewal. And since then, that has continued, but the journey has occurred in a number of different ways.
Let's go with that conversion, because I'm very concerned about that, in the sense that how do we instill that in our young people? You know, the danger is that we presume that the conveyor belt of the church is going to make sure that you put them in one end and they come out the other with a great enthusiasm. And that didn't happen to me as a young person. I don't know if it happened to you, because you went through the same rebellious stage. Would you say that that rebellious stage was just the normal stage that all teenagers go through? Was unique for you? And what about that conversion? What was it, as you look back, that helped bring about that conversion that you might let parents know that might help that happen also to their young people?
I think some of the things that we're trying to do in our own family is at least attempting to say, are there ways around bringing up children that can at least prevent some of that? I'm not sure. That's an experiment that all of us are doing. I don't think it is normative. I think if we consider the rebellion to be normal, then I think we may get into more trouble and we may actually not pray the way we should. I think there is a tremendous temptation and spiritual attack that's involved that we need to be praying against, and not just saying, oh well, it's teenage rebellion, because it's very dangerous. Yes, some people do come to the Lord after that period, but it's still dangerous. If we can prevent it and prevent the hurts that occur, I think that's the aim. When I look back on my own life, I'm sure the many people praying were key to it.
The invisible graces that were coming as a result of prayer.
Very much so. And now, obviously, both those living and dead. At the time, I saw it as only those living.
Was it an event that kind of rekindled your faith then at age 18? Or?
It was a youth rally, a weekend, in which I was, clearly I was being drawn to the Lord, but I wasn't sure. And it was a communion service, a Presbyterian communion service, that I had said I wasn't going to go to. That I was going to not watch people be cannibals. I actually said this to my friends, and they got angry and challenged me. The least I could do was sit at the back with respect. And in fact, there was a vision of Christ that I had during that time, of a little boy being held by the scruff of his neck as he was trying to battle Christ, and I realized that was me, and I had to let go. So that was 18 years old, and it was a very deep and so the issue, there had to be those people there. There had to be that faith around me But obviously it was also a sovereign act of God.
Well, it points to the power of those kinds of weekends, providing opportunities for young people to break away from the regular, to experience an opportunity to experience that. But my guess is that as with myself, when I had my adult conversion kind of like that, a similar age group is, at least for me, and I think it's probably the same for you, is it sparked within you. It's a gift to us from God to experience that reawakening, and then putting that seed within us to want to be able to help that happen in others. Yes. And my guess is, did that also kind of lead to your vocation then?
Yes, I first felt called to medicine, and I was first trained in Toronto in medical school, and I began to work thinking I was aiming at foreign missions, got involved, however, in the care of the dying, and I began to see that in fact was where God wanted me. So starting here in Montreal, we're actually the first North American hospital-based program, in the United States often referred to as hospice, in Canada usually called palliative care, began here in 1975. So I was involved at the beginning of that and continued to work in that until 1998. Interesting.
Did your evangelical conversion, their commitment to that, how did that connect with your care for the dying? I mean, I could see it very evangelistically, but were you able to do that in the hospital settings?
It's an interesting part of my journey to the church was that there was a disconnect. And I could see that Catholics, especially Catholics that I at least recognized had a living, dynamic faith, they were more comfortable with suffering and death than I was. I had scripture, I had the commitment of faith, but in the face of suffering and death, I wasn't as comfortable. They seemed to be at ease in a different way. And now I understand why. I mean, they have the sacraments. They don't just have the word. And so when words are no longer possible or appropriate, they're still actions of love, especially the Eucharist, and the communion of saints, and that sense of being at one with the church, both here and in heaven. So that led me close, but it didn't actually get me over the edge.
I remember when I was a Presbyterian pastor like yourself, and I remember going into the hospital to pray with a man in a coma and really feeling impotent. What do I do? You know, I mean, I could recite a psalm, I could pray for him, but I really felt inadequate to know what to do or how to understand where he was in relationship with Christ, or in his spiritual as well as his physical journey. I almost doing it to get it done, to get out of there, to go back to something I was more comfortable with, felt more equipped to do. But this time you were trained just as a physician. You had not gone through pastoral training yet, right?
No, and then it was actually at the bedside of the dying that I was hearing this urge to do something more, and that was, I interpret that as the call of God to the ministry, and somehow to combine it with my medical training. So I went to seminary training first here in Montreal and then to Toronto, and after a couple of years of being an assistant pastor of a congregation, I then was freed up to be full-time in the hospital setting. So I was working as a physician, but the church saw that as a full-time gospel call. So, and that's the combination that I did for most of my career until '98.
How long were you involved with that?
23 years.
After the pastoral ordination and then?
Yes.
Okay. Now, were you married during this whole time?
Only in '82, so several years after I'd become a Presbyterian minister, I was married. So most people thought I was a entrenched bachelor. And they look back, and now we have 8 children. The Lord has blessed us with 8. So they think this is quite humorous, that this bachelor with 8 children.
The reason I asked that was, so your wife didn't go through those changes in your vocation at that point. You met her and got married while you were a Presbyterian pastor then?
Yes.
Okay, was she Presbyterian?
No, she was Anglican, baptized Catholic. Her father had died, her mother remarried, and her mother had not been Catholic, so she was raised in an Anglican setting, and didn't really become Presbyterian. She always reserved that. And we were, because I was working in a hospital setting, sometimes we were in non-denominational fellowships in parts of our married life, as well as in Presbyterian congregations. So we were somewhat eclectic in our spiritual life during our marriage.
I'm curious, when you were an ordained pastor, but serving as a physician working in a hospital setting, were you still active in the pastoral sense at one particular church nearby, or were you pretty free from that?
Generally fairly free. I was, at some points, I was involved, and I'd often be asked to do retreats. And
now, a big part of your life now is farming, and we're going to eventually talk a little bit about that, but even before the Catholic issues came up in your life, you went through that vocational change, is that right?
Yes. Yes, it was all about our family. I mean, I had, at this point, 6 children. We felt very much that there was something missing in our family life. I was very busy. I had a university position. I was vice president of the hospital, which was a Catholic hospital actually, and too busy, long hours. We were homeschooling the children, but I wasn't really a part of it. I would hear about it as I would drift off to sleep at night. And I knew that wasn't right. I knew there needed to be a change. And more I felt the Lord said, we should be living together, working together, earning our living together, and learning in a more protected sense. And even then, before I was a Catholic, I saw the monastic life as a model that at least partially should be the model for a modern family. That is, some of the guarding that occurs in a monastic life, as well as the be able to focus on work and prayer. And so we eventually decided to buy a farm and try to work towards making it self-sufficient. Not self-sufficient in the sense of growing all our own food, but being able to earn a living off the farm. And it seemed, crazy.
That's a huge jump, my kids would say, from being the head of a vice president of a hospital to going to a small farm. But everybody was with you on this?
The family was with me. A lot of other people thought I was crazy, although it was an interesting thing. I decided to, anyone who had any kind of authority in my life, father-in-law, senior people in the church that I felt had counseled me in the past, I laid it out to them and asked them, what did they think I should do? And while I expected quite a few negative answers, in fact, they all came back and said, I think this is what you should do. Go for it. So there was an interesting confirmation to the Lord's call. And the children were enthusiastic. This is like an adventure. For them, it was like going around the world. Buying this farm and trying to make a living from the farm. At first, I would continue to work.
I was going to say there's a lot overlap with the two, which, talk about that. That in some ways makes it even more complicated at first, right?
Trying to milk the cow before dawn so you could rush off to go to the hospital, and make sure you wash enough so that the manure smell doesn't still be on your hands when you get to the hospital.
I will say at this point, I'm going to connect this, hold that thought, but we are on the same page here because we have a small farm. I hate to even mention it because I'm the worst farmer in the world, but I do remember there were times when I had to get up early enough in the morning to milk our Jersey cow so I could then clean myself up, get in a car, drive to the airport to fly to Birmingham so that then I could do the Journey Home program and hope that the boys were going to get the cow the next 12 hours. So I know a little bit of trying to do both at the same time.
And I think
you had that transition.
I was discouraged in that period because I began to think, this is crazy. I mean, the raccoons killed all the chickens, and there was terrible mastitis in the cow, and everything I seemed to touch was ruining, everything was falling apart.
And you live in Canada where the polar bears are, right?
Probably almost as cold as Ohio, but and we felt that the Lord was still wanting us there, and I was discouraged and wondering what was going on. And then I felt the Lord saying, Jubilee, read Leviticus 25. And I'm juggling a newborn baby at that point in the middle of the night, trying to flip open to Leviticus 25, reading it about the institution of the Jubilee, and crying and realizing I was approaching my 50th birthday, and I was to quit. I was to quit completely from my other jobs and to trust in the Lord to provide. And He has. And that refocusing and completely getting out of that other situation, I think allowed me to begin to hear His call to come home in another way. We talk about coming home. We used to talk about coming home, bringing the children home to homeschool, my coming home to be more integrated and less fragmented. But we didn't know that the Lord was smiling in the sidelines, thinking, I have another part of this coming home that you're just going to hear about soon.
I remember in the Old Testament when Sarah overheard the Lord talking about them having a child, and she laughed. Was your wife right step by step with you in your decision to leave the hospital to go full time with the farm?
Yes, she was, as in our marriage at least, she hears the Spirit first. I react by, oh no, I don't think that. And she lets it go, and then I rediscover it. Sometimes thinking it was my idea, but in fact, she's heard it before. She may not articulate it or see the whole plan. So in fact, she saw this happening in her own mind, not the coming into the Catholic Church. We both saw that at about the same time, but in terms of the farm and the support of coming in, and she's city bred. Neither of us were farmers, so this was a large, big step. I mean, most people knew her with high heels. She was Montreal, Vancouver, Toronto.
High heels don't go well around a car barn, do they? Cow barn. In America, I don't want to go yet to your Catholic phase. So you're still a Presbyterian, but now full-time farming, right?
Yes.
At this point in stage. I did notice that at least in the United States, there isn't as large of a history of Catholic examples of small farms, because in the United States, most of the Catholics emigrated to the cities because they were Protestant colonies that were a smaller percentage of Catholics. Whereas in Canada, it's the flip side, because you have the French families, which were almost all farmers. Did you have, as you were understanding what it meant to be a small farmer, were there Catholic examples that were mainly following Protestant ideas about small farming?
At that point, it was Protestant ideas of trying to return to more integrated life.
I mean, because the point is that you're not doing this just because you want to be a farmer, quote, that there were spiritual reasons for doing this.
Yes, and very much a family orientation. I mean, we could have been doing a bakery on Main Street, but there was something very special about doing it on the farm, because part of that sense of a monastic ideal, and I think the monastery was a copy of the family ideal back in its original form, with the abbot, the father, with work and prayer, with guarding, so that yes, we have guests, we have hospitality, but we guard our hearts by not being so distracted by other things in the world. So that's easier to do in a rural setting. It doesn't by itself prevent those things, but it is a little easier, and that's part of why we were wanting. But the discovery of of the spirituality of being close to the land and being able to be dependent on God in a new way, whether it's sunny or not, whether it's cold or hot, actually makes a difference to what your economic well-being is going to be this year. And your children become absolutely essential to you. They're not pets. They're given to you as a blessing to actually help you in your work. That returned me to what I think is an original view of children as a blessing. Blessing in every sense, not just a spiritual blessing, but a concrete, practical blessing.
Did you, how'd the farm do that right off the bat in the beginning?
It was not sufficient for our needs at first, but now, after about 3-4 years, it has become self-sufficient. That is, it's our only income and meeting our needs.
Of course, probably a little bit of that involves expecting less, wanting less, a more simpler lifestyle, a little more Franciscan. And again, there's an example where we have more examples from a Catholic perspective on that simplicity than we did in the Protestant world.
Yes.
You know, in that sense. All right. Well, why don't we take a break now, and we'll come back in just a second and talking about your journey into the Catholic faith. All right. So I'll be with you in just a minute. Welcome back to this Journey Home special. Our guest is John Scott. And John, thank you for giving us that quick summary of the first part of your journey. What then opened your heart to the church? Because here you are, a Presbyterian, trying to support your family full-time as a farmer, and like me, with not a huge farming background, right? But the Lord is still blessing you. What opened your heart to the Catholic Church in the midst of that journey?
One of those stories where you're not really sure. It is, I look back and I try to understand, but it was a surprise. We kept talking about coming home. This was not part of the package. In fact, we were talking about home church. That was the direction we were going. We were going to try to establish church at home, just as we were doing health at home and economics at home and school at home. And so home church was the thing we were looking at. Little did we know there was something called the domestic church, and it is key to this, but we knew we were not satisfied with the Protestant church, and we were not sure where we should be going. So there was a general dissatisfaction. It was not at first looking at the Catholic Church. What made me say one day, let's go to the Mass in the local town, I honestly don't know. I had close brush-ins with the Catholic Church several times in my spiritual life.
Where you were working at the Catholic hospital, I mean.
Yeah, Catholic hospital, the care of the dying, the charismatic renewal, the seminary itself, where I was being trained with Catholics. All of those had drawn my heart, but I'd always drawn back. Suddenly, I took the family to a Mass. They didn't like it. All this up and down, and they couldn't figure out what was going on. But something went on in my heart. And the next week, I took them back. And we never stopped. And it wasn't even an intellectual thing. It was like we were being drawn without understanding what was going on. So it is difficult for me. And I would like, when I read some other converts and they're talking about this intellectual struggle over certain theological issues, I think that wasn't for us. There was something at a much more heart level. In some ways, I was a closet Catholic for many years, as many converts probably say, because I think a lot of Protestants are. Underneath a lot of defenses, they actually have a drawing to the church. And for us, it was the theological issues I actually in some ways had solved at the time of seminary. I actually knew that the true presence was in the Catholic Mass, but I didn't want to deal with it. I didn't feel I could become a Catholic somehow. And now suddenly, all these many years later, with my troop of kids around me, I'm taking them into a Catholic church, and I'm feeling drawn, and so is my wife. And we said, what are we doing? We just have to keep going. We don't know what this do. So week after week after week, we sat, and I'm sure the prayers of the Eucharist were part of the reason that each step was taken. About that time, I contacted one of the members of the Coming Home Network who I'd heard of, Doug Lowry, who was a guest on this program once before, and he introduced me to the Coming Home Network, and I began to get some of your literature, and I had a really important connection with him, and I thought that what was happening to us wasn't just an isolated family thing. Something was going on over the whole continent, over the whole world, that Protestant clergy were being drawn back to the church in a miraculous way. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. This is not just us, but there's something bigger. Not everything was solved. The children, the older children, who'd been brought up to be very good Protestants, thought, what is going on? Mom and Dad are going nuts. This is not what we were taught. Where is Mary in the Bible? And where is this in the Bible? And interestingly, before this had happened, we had decided to study the book of James, and we actually memorized it. Memorized it partly by singing. We'd take on any ditty that we could think of, and we would attach it to parts of the book of James. And of course, isn't it interesting that it would be James that we would have chosen to prepare us biblically for many of the doctrines of the church.
Now, did Madonna House talk about its involvement in your journey?
Yeah, so about 6 months into this process, I knew I needed more spiritual direction. And I, in a long, miraculous set of circumstances, was led to Madonna House, which is an apostolate based 2 hours away from our home, but has houses throughout the world in several places in the United States. And they also have a farm where they grow much of their food. So we were connected to their farm, and they took us on. And of course, we immediately sensed that there was a covering, the covering of Our Lady over us, which I experienced as a decrease in the white noise and all the distraction in the which I think was spiritual attack. And somehow we were safe within this community that was praying for us. And I think that's very important for those who are on a journey home. Because when you're alone, neither feeling that you're Protestant any longer, nor yet Catholic, it's a very scary place.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head of why the Coming Home Network exists in the first place. Yes. Is providing others on the journey to stand beside you, to help you make sure you're hearing the right voice, not being pulled off and other things. So you found Madonna House as this wonderful umbrella that also brought you in connection with the Blessed Mother. Was the rest of your family accepting that covering?
Yes, in fact, as often happens, those children who were slower at first shot way ahead. So they were miles ahead, and in the last several months of the process, they were privately taking bets at how long Mom and Dad were going to take to figure out where they were supposed to be. They had long ago decided that they were going to become Catholics and knew we were too, but we weren't yet sure. And so it's humorous, but typical of a family. They knew it almost right away, and they connected with Madonna House very easily. And Madonna House direction was also good, because typical Protestant, I went through every word of the Catechism, and in fact, we would read it out loud together at the dinner table. Our kids were inundated with sections of the Catechism. I love the Catechism. It's just such a beautiful document. It was very helpful to me. And don't try to change it and simplify it. Just leave it the way it is. Don't revise it into some sort of milquetoast kind of version. Just leave all the references. Certainly for a Protestant, having the biblical references and the early fathers, I mean, it's absolutely essential. But I think Madonna House was able to say, you know more about the Catholic Church than most Catholics. It's a hard issue right now. Yes, you can talk and read, but it's mostly listen to the Lord drawing you. And that in the end was the convincing part, that there will be some things I won't know until I enter into the church, and there are some things I won't know until I am in heaven, and that's okay. And that critical point where I could still with integrity say, yes, this is the church, and I must submit to it.
How long did that process take?
Just a little over a year.
All right. What was, let's just reflect a little bit on that journey. You said that in many ways a lot of the theological issues were taken care of along the way. Was there, though, in the process any particular doctrine, for example, especially coming from your Presbyterian Calvinist background that was maybe a hurdle that was more difficult than others to get over?
Well, one that was critical for me, but handled fairly early, was the issue of authority and the authority of Scripture versus the church. And it didn't take a lot of reading to realize that there was a blinder up there that I just had not recognized, that what was obvious to anyone reading Scripture or hearing the history of the church is that the church gave authority to the Scripture. It allowed the Scriptures to be formed into a canon, and it's the church's book. And once I came to that, a lot of other issues started to be resolved. So certainly the doctrines of Mary were difficult. The sense of wanting to enter into a relationship with Mary as opposed to just trying to fight off the dogmas. Allowing, again, my heart to be touched was critical, as opposed to the smoke screen of intellectuality that Protestants often use to keep away from what God is wanting for them.
Well, in a sense, you were fortunate that the Lord and His leading had you deal with the key issue up front, the issue of authority, right? Because once you get that one in line, then you're trusting the church as the interpreter.
Yes.
And so whatever these other doctrines are, you have the interpreter to help you see it. And often the other people on the journey are dealing with each issue along the way, and then they deal with authority. So you were blessed in that sense. And so again, you and your wife came in together.
Yes.
Were any of these issues still difficult for her to accept on the journey, or?
It was like this as we went along, so that she would be ahead in one area and I would be having difficulty, but actually, by God's grace, very close, and the children too. So when we were all received together as a whole family, which was a wonderful blessing. We were at the chapel of Madonna House, and the 10 of us, we had a newborn baby who was baptized just after our reception, and so it was a glorious coming home, and we saw it that way and talked about it that way.
Well, given the fact you have 10, you probably have no problem with Catholic views of pro-life issues. I'm guessing you brought that right in with you, but yes. Was there any struggle at all in leaving the Presbyterian world and the Catholic world in the issues of pro-life?
Probably the struggles have more been in encountering the lack of faith in Catholics concerning that, because it's an interesting little sidelight to our journey, in that early in our marriage, although taught that contraception in the Presbyterian faith would be acceptable, we did not feel comfortable as a man and wife concerning this. And we in fact decided and went and were trained in natural family planning within a year or two of our marriage. And in fact, after a few more years, we also didn't feel comfortable with natural family planning, in that at least the way we were using it, it was a form of saying to God, okay, we'll accept within these limits, but don't give us more than we want. It was telling him that this area is off limits to him. And we felt called to say, no, at the moment at least, we are to be totally open to all of your blessings. They're like arrows in the hand of a warrior. There's nothing that, that they're not burdens. There are burdens in life, and there's burdens having 8 children, but it's not because of the children, it's burdens of life. Before we had very many children, we always talked about children as a blessing, but we often mean that in a rather mild, meek and mild sort of way, which is not the strong, hard, full blessing of trusting God. For us, the scripture about that children are like arrows in the hand of a warrior, that in fact they're needed for the work that we have. They're actually needed for the spiritual warfare of the church and for the family. And they're not add-ons. They're not little things to make us happy. They're essential for the health of the family. So this sense of saying, for us, this was important to abandon ourselves, relinquish that area of control, not without prayer, not without a sense of responsibility, but really giving it to God. And that has been a wonderful liberation. We, to some extent, that was a scary thing then, to become a Catholic and realize that actually we made people feel more guilty in the church than we ever did in the Protestant church, where they don't, oh well, some people have large families, some people have small families. They weren't taking it personally. We go into a Catholic church and you see all kinds of guilt on the faces of people, feeling of, or longing, or I wish, and it's actually painful for us to watch. People say, oh, I came from a family of 8 or 10 or 12. And there's this deep longing for the blessings of God. And yet they don't feel they can take hold of that. And they can, but they need to let go of the lie that is holding them back.
When we look at what's happened in our cultures in the Western world, it's hard to draw direct cause and effects, but at least we can look at parallel developments. And of course, some of the parallel developments are that as the morality, as materialism has grown, morality has gone down, a lot of these things have happened. We do see the fragmentation, the family as a parallel. Cause and effects are probably intermingled all along, but of course one of those is that every single person in the family has their own separate little kingdoms that they're developing. You know, the father has his kingdom, the mother has her kingdom. Each kid is often through their different little, you know, each little grade is divided up by age groups, and they're all divided and fragmented. Mm-hmm. And so again, whether there's cause and effects there is hard to exactly pinpoint, but they're parallel. Yes. And so we need to pray, each one of us, how is God calling us to respond to this for the good of our children? You know, and again, I know that my audience has often heard me mention Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 many times, but as I listen to your story, trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not into your own understanding, in all your ways acknowledge Him, and He'll direct your paths. Mm-hmm. Would you say that's exactly what God has done in your life?
Absolutely.
I mean, there's the beauty of that. Talk a little bit about, now from a Catholic perspective, as you look back on the meaning of suffering. In your becoming Catholic and understanding Catholic theology, would that have given you some insight that maybe you wish you'd had back when you were dealing there in the hospitals with the suffering?
Many, when I especially saw the ability to deal with suffering in Catholics in families, because I worked a lot in Catholic hospitals, because the Catholic orders have felt the call to serve the dying, I would come into contact and go into the homes of Catholic families, and some of them have become very dear to me, and some of them I still keep in touch with. And they would be such an inspiration. They wouldn't be able to quote Job, they wouldn't be able to give a biblical reference, but they lived out a life of faith in the midst of suffering in a way that I wasn't in touch with, including children who were dying and were teaching me something. And it's something to do with the fullness of the church, and the disconnect between the mind and the heart. And I think the Catholic sacramental life allows that more fullness to occur in dealing with suffering, where we can enter in to the suffering of Christ in the Eucharist and in our own suffering in a way that is not approachable to the Protestant.
Yeah, that verse in Colossians 1:24 about us completing what is lacking in the suffering of Christ. Well, as a Presbyterian, I didn't even know how to deal with that passage, because I believe Christ had done it all sufficiently, and that my will was completely depraved. And so somehow in the midst of that, how am I complete? I didn't know it. But this aspect, which I think John Paul so clearly describes in his encyclical on the issue of suffering, which I highly recommend to everyone to read, which is all about, and then it's really basically a biblical study of Colossians 1:24, and how understanding that suffering and the mystery of it somehow is redemptive. That our suffering, even a child's, is redemptive. And offering that up and helping us offering it up. And isn't that idea of offering up struggles, the things that don't go the way we want them to go, or we hope they would go, a key aspect of living on a farm? I mean, talk about that now as a Catholic farmer. What aspects of your Catholic faith have helped you even appreciate more your decision to be a small farmer?
One of the writings of the founder of Madonna House, Catherine Doherty, is a small book called Apostolic Farming, where farming becomes a way of showing that you are an apostle, an ambassador of Christ. And it's a wonderful little book. Part of the connection for me as a farmer is the total dependence. Another is the sense of humility. Humility, humus, ground. Sometimes it does feel like we're on the ground. So it's humorous sometimes, but not always very funny when you're going through it. The sense, especially as a newbie farmer, the sense of not being able to function. So not having the skill, not being sure what to do next, being out of control. And in this case, having my children around me when this is going on. Watching me, seeing how I'm dealing with my temper or my discouragement. But that's the way it should be. And obviously seeing how much is given to us. I mean, I don't cause the grass to grow, and I don't cause the animals to get healthy and produce food for us. It's something given. So every day there's this sense of gratefulness for what the Lord has done.
You said newbie farm. That's a farmer. That's a good term. Mine was always wannabe farmer. I hate to even mention it because I'm gone so much that I'm lucky if I get the grass cut on our acreage. But there really is a beauty of that. And in fact, even let me say this now to those that are watching. If there are any of you out there who are Catholic farmers, we've often talked about the need for Catholic farmers to be connected, to be supportive of one another and pass along ideas, because from a Catholic perspective, did the ideas of Chesterton and Belloc and this distributism have an influence on your call to farming at all?
It didn't. I was called up sometime about a few months after becoming a Catholic, someone had heard of this. A Chesterton magazine called me up and said, "You obviously know all about Chesterton and distributism, and that's what led you to this." And I said, "I've never even heard of it." So they introduced me to those writings, which are very exciting and very much in line with what the Lord had done for us, but it wasn't based on the writings that we did it.
What about your old Presbyterian buddies and friends, pastors you went to seminary with? Have you had any responses from them about your journey? Any inquiries as to your journey to the Catholic Church?
Almost none. Very closed. I think afraid. I think along with some I wish, somewhat like when I left the hospital to go to the farm, there were a lot of doctors who were jealous. They wished they could have done it. And likewise, I think in terms of the journey home to the church, it's too threatening to deal with head on. I wasn't able to go to our 20th anniversary, is it 20 or 20, more than 20, at the seminary, but I wrote them a letter and included an interview that had been done of me talking about going to the church, and I described in detail what had happened and why, and gave it to my classmates to read. And so I'm wondering if some of that might lead to some conversations.
I wasn't invited to my 20th, but maybe they just couldn't find me. How did your readings in the early church fathers help in your journey? Because many of us went to seminary, we didn't even touch the early fathers in at least my Presbyterian training.
Well, I had gone to Toronto where you could choose various colleges, and I actually went to a Jesuit college to have some early church father courses. So that was very exciting, and I think, again, one of those seeds that were sown. So I was always, I recognized the Catholic view of history, and obviously even a good student of Calvin knows that this disconnect from the early church fathers that has occurred in the Protestant church doesn't even make sense to him. I mean, he's very grounded in the early church fathers. He distorts it, but he
saw the need to be connected.
He did.
But he was uncomfortable with it.
Whereas most Protestants of the modern era don't even realize what was being written.
I'm wondering, as we close this little segment, I think the Lord has, both for your successes and failures, and I'm there too, the Lord has probably taught you some things about parenting. And I wonder if maybe some words of encouragement to those that might be watching. People there may not have maybe not even have the desire, but also yet have the freedom to break free and do what you and your family are doing. But still, from what you've learned, any words of encouragement to those who are watching in the areas of parenting particularly?
We call our farm Heartland Farms, from Malachi 4, turning the hearts of the children to their fathers and the hearts of the fathers to their children. I think it's about hearts, and I think it's about guarding hearts and imprinting hearts. We call our homeschooling method discipleship, not education or schooling, because we're wanting them to be discipled by us, and especially to our hearts. So the image is of embracing them so close that what's on my heart will be imprinted on their heart. And that includes everything, obviously especially our faith. The guarding of their hearts. There's so many distractions that I think the main thing is to be bold and to be less fearful of guarding, radically guarding our hearts and our children's hearts. There are so many things that draw us away from what's important. It seems so scary to say no, no, no to all the various distractions. It seems so negative or kind of legalistic. But I think you can do it in the monastic tradition of men who are choosing actively and very maturely to say, no, I have something more important to do. Therefore, I'm not going to be distracted in this way. So looking at every aspect of life and trying to radically guard your family.
This phrase, guarding your hearts, is so important. Sadly on the one hand, because at least in Western Christianity in the last century or so, it seems that the theology of the heart is not quite as strong as it is in the Eastern churches, nor is discussion about the fear of God, which is more discussed in the Eastern churches. And we need that balance of mind and heart, as well as love of God and fear of God. You're right, we need both. And in fact, I'm wondering if some of the Eastern writings, like of the Eastern Fathers, had an influence on your own spirituality and your growth into the Catholic faith.
Probably not much reading, but again, Madonna House is by ritual with Eastern and Western. So I think I've absorbed, as a Catholic, that combination through them.
Okay, because that idea of guarding the heart is so essential. I'm glad you brought that up. I know that Mother Angelica often talked about conversion of the heart and getting close to Jesus, and really with all the other voices coming on in our lives from every different angle, it's helping our young people understand how to protect the heart and let in that which is of God through His church and through His spiritual guides that we have for us, and yet being very protective of those other voices that are counterfeit, trying to pull us away. Let's take one last break, and we'll be back in a moment with some final words for the journey home. Welcome back. Our guest is John Scott. John, how has becoming a Catholic, it's a big question, but if you look back with your long journey following Jesus, yet how has becoming a Catholic even more strengthened your faith in Christ?
It's like entering a mansion with many different doors. So that's one of the exciting parts, is that it's not finished. It's like suddenly I realize there are far more doors. I am closer to the Lord. I am more excited about Scripture than ever before. Things are making sense. The penny is dropping all over the place. Things that I have avoided because I didn't want to go there, I have blocked. And I find that in the Catholic Church, I'm more integrated, I'm more whole. Things are making sense for me personally and for my family. So it's been an exciting, wonderful 4 years.
Well, John, thank you very much for joining us on the journey home. You gave me some hope, even though I'm not doing very good at my farming, that you gave me some hope that there are models out there that in really truly seeking the Lord to follow Him, He does bless. But I also thank you for your witness. I came from a Presbyterian background myself, and I know of men and women that we're working with in the Journey Home, in the Coming Home Network, that are still on the journey and who are probably watching and are encouraged by men like yourself who are willing to take the big jump, the big leap, and trusting the Lord. So thank you very much for your witness. And I thank you for joining us on the journey home. Whenever I'm talking with someone who works on the farm, I'm reminded of all those parables that Jesus uses about the farm, about planting and about God's providence, especially that wonderful parable of the sower who sowed the seeds on the different soils. And what was interesting is that a good farmer might look at a rocky soil and say, well, it's not going to grow there, so I'm not going to put the seed there. But he recognizes that God has the power to do anything. But God can bring wheat even out of a rocky soil. That's God. He can do lots of things in our hearts. When I think about that, my encouragement to you is to share your faith with your family and friends. And don't be put off by the rocky soil you might see. Oh, it won't grow there. He won't come to church. You know, he won't be open to this. Don't you be the judge. Let God be the giver. Let God be the one that opens up that person's heart. You be the one that plants the seed. Thank you very much for joining us on the journey home, and I'll see you again next time. God bless.